Right? Strategic autonomy is the buzzword in Brussels today. And strategic autonomy presupposes that the EU has an external sort of freedom of action. And going to West Africa and Sahel and countries kicking out Europeans, mainly the French now, it's precisely that the Europeans are not mature enough to see or to acknowledge that sovereignty could be on the African side. So they cannot accept that anything could come from within African states themselves, from movements and so on. It has to be something from outside, just like in the 50s, the Bandung movement will influence Africa in the wrong way. And right now it's Russia or China and so on, because there's nothing really, Africa is hollow in the political sense still for the European mindset.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to two colleagues from Europe and Africa. I've got with me Peo Hansen, a professor of political science at Sweden's Linköping University, and Aghogho Akpome, a associate professor of literature and English at South Africa's University of Zululand. Both of them have worked on the issue of European colonialism in Africa, and Peo recently published another great article entitled The Return of the Repressed, the Colonial History of the EU's Geopolitical Turn. This unfinished business of Europe's colonial mindset is what we want to discuss today. So, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time, both of you. And maybe we start with you, Peo. You wrote this article in which you are making the argument that this geopolitical turn of Europe, of the EU, is not as new as they try to make it look. Could you maybe lay out your argument for a moment?
Yes. I mean, of course, roughly since 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea, this sense of a geopolitical turn in the European Union has been growing exponentially, and not the least with 2022 and the war in Ukraine. It has been, taken on new proportions. So that is clearly new, right? But the question is how we relate this historically, because what the EU is doing is to say that it has to change. It has to become geopolitical. And then the EU, but also a lot of scholars, the think tanks, the media, and so on, punditry, they are very, there's a consensus here that this is a thoroughly new thing. The EU was born in the 50s as a peace project, as a democratic sort of freedom proponent, and that it didn't have anything to do with geopolitics other than the situation in Europe proper. So yes, it is acknowledged that in the 50s, the Cold War Europe scene, that had a lot to do with the formation of the EU. But the EU's role was to play a peaceful role and even an anti-geopolitical role. If we compare that to today, yes, the rhetoric, we can see that there are differences. But if you look at it historically, the EU was actually founded as a geopolitical project, as a geoeconomic project too. And that had everything to do with how it related to Africa, mostly the French and the Belgian colonies. So this is where my work together with Stefan Johnson on Euro-Africa comes in, because Euro-Africa was the name given by the EU to the association regime that was created in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome, which associated a large part of Africa with the EU. Algeria was a special case. It was actually formally incorporated into the EU, or EEC, as it was called then. So my argument is simply to say, look, don't call this new until you studied the history here. So when I'm arguing the return of the repressed is really the return of the unmentionable, because the image that the EU wants to propagate is, of course, that it gave peace a chance. It was a peace project, and so it protects that sort of immaculate conception, if you like. But what I'm saying is that there's never been such a thing. The EU has always been involved in geopolitics, and so what scholars and the EU officials are saying today, that they are being forced to become geopolitical because there's so much foul play on part of Russia and China and so on, is very, very flawed. It's actually return to the roots of the European project. I also add there that there's, of course, a lot of, right now, the EU is also comparing itself a lot to the post-Cold War EU, because there they give the EU project the sense that the post-Cold War EU was also a peace project, but in a different way. It was the sort of multilateral, it was the becoming the model for the world. That was the sort of, and again, a lot of scholars worked on this, saying that the EU would rule the 21st century because of its unique anti-geopolitical sense and so on. So in the article, I also go back to the post-Cold War era and show that no, it's not true. The EU was very geopolitical during this era too, yet in a different way than now in many ways, but it still was geopolitical, and I think that has to be taken into account to understand what is going on today.
And I find this very interesting because this view of the Europeans as a pure peace project, right, that never does any kind of repressive act. That's something that Aghogho, I mean, you also worked on that, and you worked on the literature part as well. What is,
Yeah.
let me ask you this way. Do you think that Africans from various countries look at the EU and Europe as a peace project?
Not at all. Not at all. And I thank Peo. I read your paper once. I'm sure I'll read it again. I think that's brilliant work, and it's also the stuff that decolonial scholars, both largely from Latin America, but an increasing number across Africa and other parts of the world, have also paid attention to this. And yes, to your question again, Pascal, no. Not in this generation have Africans who pay attention considered the European involvement in global affairs as a peace project. Peace, yes, for Europeans. And if you grow up in the academy in South Africa, in Africa, if you pay attention, you would understand the significance of the semiotics, of the linguistics. So it's a bit like human rights. Who is the human? When somebody is steeped in the European ethos talks about the human, they're looking at a creature differently than you who are not steeped in that ethos think about. So peace, yes, maybe for Europe, maybe between Germany and the UK, maybe between Germany and France, but peace not for Africa. Not for Africa, not for the parts of the world that remain in the peripheries. So we've never thought of that. And I think we need to really pay attention to the semiotics. So I find this tension in Peo's paper, and even he is trying to show the continuities and to dispel the deceptive posturing of the Europeans that they are for peace. But when you get sucked into the European, maybe the English language, I don't know what it is in other languages. English is the language I've studied the most, and of course my home language. So the idea of the past and the present, the idea of a return, because when you say return, you're suggesting that there was an actual departure. But I see it's the paradox, it's the contradiction brought about by language, not by intent. So Europe has been where it has been. I would say even from the 1884s in regard to Africa and the non-core, the non-metropole I could use the word periphery, but I also am very careful with the words I use.
So do you the way that Europe looks at Africa, I find that quite interesting. Peo, and you also in your paper you write about this view that what happens with Africa is not is something that the European Union and European countries engage with, and that of course they do not perceive as colonial anymore. But the way that they act, the political decisions, again, the incorporation of Algeria, and then also this association with the with African states that were still colonized, and the language that's being used. You've looked at that. Can you maybe go a little bit deeper into these ways in which the Europeans aren't even aware that they still talk in colonial terms?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting when the EU has this discourse around Africa. It can get away with a lot of colonial tropes, and it can do that because it styles itself as a post-colonial project historically. France, Britain, many other European colonial powers could not really use this rhetoric today. I mean, they still do, but then they're met with protests, and there's always a tension there. The EU project, however, speaks about Africa in a very colonial idiom, yet it can do it because it feels that there is no history here. The EU proper doesn't have a colonial history. It is a post-colonial history. But yet, I look at, for instance, the former Josep Borrell, the EU's former high commissioner, the high diplomat, the foreign chief of the EU. He said in 2021, he said, as Africa's neighbor and its main partner, we are directly concerned by the conditions in which the rise of this young and dynamic continent takes place. If we do not give this matter sufficient attention, others will, and probably at our expense. So I take that, and there's so many statements like this. And then I compare that to how the debate went in around the foundation of the European Union in 1957. So here's a quote in Le Monde from 1957, from February 1957. So right before the Treaty of Rome was signed. And here their opinion paper page, the op-ed page, states that, quote, the six, meaning the six founding members of the EU, the six are also aware that the political fate of Europe is more or less linked to that of Africa, and that if other influences were to supplant ours in these territories, serious risks would appear on the horizon. So again, that there is this competition for Africa, and for the longest time, the EU sort of owned that competition, and there was very little competition. For the past 20 years or so, it's the picture has changed dramatically, and the EU doesn't like that. It doesn't like to have competition in Africa. So that's why the situation gets more and more tense. So I focus on that, and that's where the EU rhetoric becomes even more sort of collecting from the colonial days.
Yeah, because the idea is we have to be strong in Africa so others cannot be here. And then I suppose if you go to South Africa or to Nigeria, Aghogho, I guess competition is something that a lot of people would welcome, no?
That's interesting, but well, not kind of. Africans revile the idea which Peo has expressed so articulately, that Africa is a pawn, is something to be taken either by Europe or by America or by China or by Russia. It's a very condescending, a very, very racist idiom. And I'm using Peo's words. I like to refer again to Peo, and I think that's a brilliant comment he made when he talks about Europe self-styling itself as post-colonial. there's a lot of deception in the language that is used by these, you may want to say neo-colonial, but many decolonial scholars like to talk of coloniality, by which they make a clear distinction between those moments, those historical moments that pretended to be post-colonial, especially the moments of the creation of the Westphalian idea of the nation state across Africa. And again, the moment of the purported granting of independence, which is around the time that the EU was founded. In 1957, Ghana became independent. And in 1960, about 16 or 17 African states became independent. And by 1963, there were about 30 when they held the first meeting of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. It's important to pay attention to the ways in which these are performances of change, which do not contain any actual change. They are performances of change which are made in order to preserve the colonial project. And what is the colonial project? Is dependence, it's extraction, it's extractivism, it's racism, it's othering. Since that hasn't changed, and I think largely that I can find that at the root of Peo's argument, then really nothing has changed. What has changed is the way that these ideas are being performed and the way they are being discussed, the rhetorics that have been used, the narrative maneuvers that have been employed to suggest, for instance, that the EU is now interested because of the situation in the Ukraine. An interesting document was published in 2011, A New Geography of European Power. This was before Crimea, before 2014. This was published in 2011. These are the think tanks already mapping how they would incurse into, especially North Africa. Libya, Gaddafi happened in 2011, not 2014. So these excuses can be easily, anyone who is paying attention can easily put them aside to understand what exactly is at the heart of the European project and the purpose of the EU, which is clearly not to project any kind of peace, but to continue in its hard power. Peo uses that term also, in its geopolitical, aggressive, militaristic projects under the guise of peace. And I think it's clear once we pay close attention, except that unfortunately not everyone is paying attention. And I'll end with this. Jan Oberg, which Peo might know, you know what he says, Pascal, I'm sure you've been in touch with him a lot. You know what he says? He talks about the MIMAC, the military, industrial, media, and academic complex. So, and I think that's very correct, because the media and academia have been key to the EU's, to the Anglo-American, and I don't think we can keep America out of this conversation, deception that even many citizens, many otherwise intelligent Euro-American citizens believe fully that they are not involved in this geopolitical maneuvers because of the successful, I would say, but very devious integration of the media and academia into this business. And they're still doing it today. They've not relaxed. They still give, if you look at the descriptions they give of Africa, the descriptions they give about China and Russia, it is still that these guys are trying to incurse into our backyards. We have to keep them off. It's still extremely racist, extremely colonial, and extremely disgusting.
The language used in this image, the one thing that always surprises me is that Europe, or Europeans in general, seem to have so little understanding that colonialism is not a thing of the past. And Peo, I think also in your research, you look at that also, how how not only the past experience of colonialism and the early roots of colonial Europe are being forgotten, but how they constantly are being basically thought, like pushed away. Do you think, maybe this goes to both of you, like what is recently happening in West Africa and like Burkina Faso with like, you know, emancipation of several states who kick out the French and don't let in the Americans, and the portrayal of this as being something nefarious coming from Russia and being supported, is that like part of this general framing of anything that happens in Africa as basically coming from the outside or having to come from the outside? Maybe, Peo, can you speak to this first and then Aghogho?
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there, Pascal, because it is portrayed in that sense. And that goes back to, if you look at the founding of the EU in the 50s and the whole question of anti-colonial movements, the Bandung movement, and so on. What European politicians and media, and also American scholars, that was a sort of the IR sense at the time, that the transformation of the world into a system of independent nation state, that was not something they wanted to happen. So they did everything to keep the world in this sort of more plural sense of having great powers, empires, colonial empires, still sort of dominating the world. And they feared the nation state as as an upsetter to that system. And so they always portrayed the nation state as old-fashioned, as something archaic that we already had done and we shouldn't repeat, when in fact that system had never seen the light of day, right? That system was the post-1960s world, when every border became a border to another, legally speaking, independent nation state. So sovereignty was a curse word amongst the leaderships in Western Europe at the time. They despised sovereignty, and they
for the others.
Yeah, exactly, and praised interdependence. You have all these new words. So colonialism is not colonialism, it's interdependence. It is development. It is all those nice words. And they did that precisely to protect their own independence and their own sovereignty. And the French IR scholar Raymond Aron, he spoke a lot about that, as did Stanley Hoffman and others. They constantly said that, you know, Europe or Western Europe can only keep its autonomy if it keeps its colonies. And that goes today, right? Strategic autonomy is the buzzword in Brussels today. And strategic autonomy presupposes that the EU has an external sort of freedom of action. And going to West Africa and Sahel and countries kicking out Europeans, mainly the French now, it's precisely that the Europeans are not mature enough to see or to acknowledge that sovereignty could be on the African side. So they cannot accept that anything could come from within African states themselves, from movements and so on. It has to be something from outside, just like in the 50s, the Bandung movement will influence Africa in the wrong way. And right now it's Russia or China and so on, because there's nothing really, Africa is hollow in the political sense still for the European mindset. So I think that's very important to have that sort of historical connection, keep that alive.
Aghogho, do you want to speak to that?
So I'll respond in this way. Again, I'll take my cue from Peo's the end part of Peo's comment. When we say that European ideologues cannot see, for instance, that there could be autonomy and sovereignty in Africa, I do think they can. I think the problem is that they understand that European hegemony, European dominance, relies on the subjugation of other parts of the world, especially Africa, Latin America, and many parts of Asia. They understand that. They understand that the thriving chocolate industry in Belgium and Switzerland, the basic condition of possibility for that is the extractivism that goes on in West Africa, because all of that cocoa, or the vast majority of that cocoa, comes from Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria. They understand that if Ghana, Nigeria, and Cote d'Ivoire, if cocoa farmers have sovereignty, if they can determine the price and the trade in cocoa, that entire multi-billion euro industry would crumble. They would lose their power. They understand that. It's perhaps the ordinary is not a very good term, but it's perhaps the other Europeans who do not understand. The other Europeans who have been lied to for the past 60 or 80 years that they are dominant. They have these beautiful streets in Brussels, in Berlin, in France, because they are hardworking, they are very intelligent. Those are the people who may not understand, but it's because they're not paying attention. But the think tanks who write papers like this, the new geography of European power, they know very well. That's why they have this iron grip on the political class, to ensure that the same aggressive, the same militaristic, extractivist patterns that were inaugurated in the 1800s, that they are maintained in one way or the other. And they devise language, they devise rhetoric, they devise foreign policies that deflect from the reality, that makes it seem as if there's no continuity, that makes it seem as if all that is past. But they understand, and they are returned to the idea of strategic autonomy. I would say is the civil war playing out in the West right now. The competition for the control, for the core, between the neocons, the neolibs, and people like Donald Trump and people like Macron, who seek to reestablish themselves as being in charge of the global geopolitical calculus. But the guys who do that, they very well understand that in order for them to carry on living as hegemons, they need to deny autonomy and sovereignty to people in Africa largely. They need that. Otherwise, how are they going to get access to the cobalt in the DRC? Watch the space of the DRC. It's not going to be stable in decades to come, as far as the eye can see. How else are they going to get access to 60% of the world's cobalt deposits? If they allow the DRC, if they grant that sovereignty is a right of the Congolese. That's the point.
It's then even, it gets even tougher for me to look at this, especially when I then hear the talk, and maybe Peo, you can talk to this, like talk about stability, building stability, when actually we understand that a lot of the mechanisms of exploitation of the African continent build around the instability and foster the instability within countries. I mean, the fact that there's still how many states that use the French, the French African franc? It's still over 10, isn't it?
Well, I think it's even more, 14 or 18 or something.
14 to 18. And a lot of this has to do with internal competition that then can be encouraged on the one side or the other. Once one of the regimes has the idea to get rid of that franc. Peo, or can you speak a little bit more to the mechanisms that are currently in use and that link up with Europe to keep the special relationship between the EU and African countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aghogho has already spoken to that very well. But I think, I mean, we can, some examples may be good. I mean, prior to the war in Ukraine in 22, the EU was on this bandwagon pressuring African countries to decarbonize. So they should pump less oil and gas and so on, and sort of decrease their production. Then came Russia's attack on Ukraine, and the world changed. And all of a sudden, the whole gas relationship to Russia broke down. And then the EU and European countries changed their mind, and then they pressured Africa to increase the drilling and the production of fossil energy, and also to create new pipeline systems. Instead of gas from Russia, they wanted gas from Algeria through Morocco, and so on. And that just shows how the Europeans try to dictate industrial development and big structural changes in African countries. And they frame it as, oh, it's a green progressive, the EU is great. They turn around and it's all fossil EU again. And it's again the interests. We have to look at the interests, underlying interests here. And sometimes they may be hard to see immediately, and sometimes they're very, very transparent, like in this case. But it continues that like that. But then again, there is much more leverage for many African countries today against the EU, and I think that is the big irritant and danger for the Europeans, that they see that they are oftentimes they're not African countries' first pick. They go with China or they go with someone else, and that is a scandal for the EU. They don't accept that, and again, it sort of reflects on the fact that the EU has a difficult time accepting and acting. I mean, look at how they guard and see Ukraine's sovereignty as sacred. But sovereignty in Africa has never been like that, and it continues to be something that is very relative, and that shows again that the strategic autonomy for the EU depends on encroaching on others' sovereignty. For instance, in Africa, that's how strategic autonomy, because it is geopolitics, it is that hardcore sovereignty, which always has to have this external leeway and autonomy to make, as there was an article in Financial Times by Mark DeVos, who is this think tank leader. He wrote an op-ed in Financial Times on the 12th of May, and he just wrote, the European project is now a hard power project that needs a geostrategic footprint beyond its current boundaries. And how can that sort of geostrategic footprint be in compliance with international law? It cannot. So there's no difference here between what the EU moralizes around Russia or a bunch of other countries that are encroaching on sovereignty beyond their borders. That's what the Europeans are doing, have always done, and now they want to do that to a larger extent. Yet we keep this moral notion that the EU is different, but it's not.
Aghogho, overall, does it worry you, or do you know of African colleagues who are worried about these tunes coming from Europe, or is this more something you look at and say like, yeah, that's what it has always been, so we know how to deal with this?
I think it's both. Again, it depends on who you are talking about, who you are speaking to. Just as in Europe, we have, and I've picked this up recently in my in interaction with European colleagues, of which I have a lot. There are indeed colleagues who are not paying attention. I mean, and I digress a bit here, take the issue of migration. I do work on migration as well. I've been in a room with European colleagues who are genuinely shocked that the biggest migrant camps, refugee camps in this world are not in Europe. That more Africans pour into other African countries than they do into Europe. I mean, these are respected academics who are shocked. You know what I mean? So, I'm sorry about that. Did I freeze for a moment?
No, you're good.
Sorry. Yeah. So, yes, there may be African scholars who Like, I know I've encountered some African scholars who are shocked about USAID. Oh, they are getting USAID, and seem to have been unaware that USAID has never been a friend of Africans. Yeah, but I think those who pay attention know that this has always been the case. If you look at economics, for instance, all this hoopla about the myth of the China debt trap, and Peo made reference to it. That's one very effective form of extractivism. And look at when the Bretton Woods institutions were formed, 44, 45. Just as we came out of the old system and the US began to assume dominance, and it was very clear that the British Empire, for instance, was on its last legs. So the colonial system mutated very cleverly into the nation state system, at least for other parts of the world. And the extractivism that was done in clearer, more obvious, more graphic ways took less graphic means through the debt system. And at a point where, when the IMF and World Bank began to exercise pushbacks, then you see that a lot of the debts now goes through or come from the London and the Paris Club, which are European organizations, European member states, and they continue to extract monies from this part of the world, especially from Africa. Some colleagues of mine were very shocked the other day when I told them that, do you know you could travel to Switzerland with a bag full of whatever currency and not have to declare it? And you know, from Mobutu Sese Seko, which was a very big case, and maybe Nigeria's Abacha, that the vast majority of the laundered funds from Africa, the traceable laundered funds, where are they? They are in Switzerland, they are in mansions in Paris, they are in London. So that extractivism has never really stopped. It has never really stopped. And I'll end this answer with this. It's something I learned very recently, and it shocked me, even me. In 2011, I think 2010 or 2011, when there was crisis in the Ivory Coast, right? And Laurent Gbagbo versus the current president, Alassane Ouattara. Gbagbo was captured in Abidjan. And the Times of London reports that a major factor that led to his eventual capture was some activity in a tunnel, in an actual physical tunnel that connects the presidential palace to, guess what, the French embassy. That Gbagbo had erected a wall in that tunnel and it was blown up by UN or whichever forces, and that made it easy. The idea that as of 2011, and I think that tunnel would still be there today, there is a physical tunnel linking the presidential palace of a head of state with the embassy of a European country in 2011. Even I was shocked. But that tells you how it has happened and how it continues to happen.
Yeah, so basically these very clear colonial ties of the past have never been cupped. They have been renamed and so on. But at the same time, maybe toward the end of the discussion, I would still like to point out a couple of new things in this relationship. I mean, one thing that is very pivotal, especially for international law, is at the moment the actions of South Africa toward the other colonial project and the very highly violent genocidal colonial project in the Middle East of the genocide in Gaza, and how South Africa and many African states actually joined this lawsuit at the ICJ, which is basically opposed unanimously by almost all European states and North America. Yeah. Are we still seeing a shift in the overall, or let's say in the traditional balance of power between the two continents? Maybe we start with Aghogho and then go to Peo.
I would say we are beginning to see the potentials, the possibilities of shifts, but I think this is more at the instance, and I use that word advisedly, or this is occasioned more by the relative decline of U.S. power, the realization of the limits of number one, U.S. military power, as is being demonstrated in the battlefields in Ukraine. And I think it's important at this point to also stress that when we speak of the UK, of the EU, of Europe returning to the idea of hard power, and I think that's a deceptive term. I've never really accepted it because in my understanding of the history, the dominance of Europe has always been occasioned by hard power, by military, by aggressive genocidal power. Even though the EU seemed to retreat from that stance, from that posture, it wasn't by choice. It was 1945. And it wasn't an end, it was a transfer to the US. And the Europe has always been a key partner of the US foreign aggression, always. And I think what they are doing now, the idea of strategic autonomy, is a realization occasioned by Trump's apparent departure from that understanding that you may no longer receive blanket cooperation in the wars you choose to fight. So it's not really a change of heart, it's a change of tactic. The ideas are still the same. They rode on that power. And take the NATO bombardment of Libya. They participated. I think you remember, Pascal, in that conference of ours, and that foreign minister was telling us how European troops were involved and they needed airspace permission to send those bombs to Libya.
Yeah.
So Europe had used that effectively. And they still use it, by the way, and they want to keep using it. What they are doing, in my view, can be understood as a contingency plan. For those years, during those years, we might have a Trumpish kind of president who cannot guarantee the agreement. We need to have a plan B. I think that's what they are doing. It's not a change of heart. It doesn't represent any discontinuity of what they have been doing. So I hope I got I answered the question, or did I go too much on a tangent?
No, I mean there is a change of
okay, yeah, you're talking about urgency.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I think there's possibility, and if we can talk about that, the US's relative decline, of course, happening at the same time with China's very significant rise, especially in diplomacy and in the economy, and Russia's resurgence, especially both diplomatically as a key member of the BRICS, and also diplomatically in terms of the memories that we have of the Soviet involvement in liberation struggles on the continent, because that's very important. You read reviews today who like to speak of Africans like they are idiots for appearing to be sympathetic to Russia. They have a history. They have a history with the Soviet Union. They have a history with Cuba. And of course, the optics we are getting from the Ukraine, demonstrating that US and the Anglo-American confrontation with a real-time confrontation with a military peer rival is showing that they are not as invincible as we have been made to believe all these decades. So I think this has engendered hope in many Africans, and perhaps one way in which that hope is being demonstrated is in the Sahel, where ties with the US and European powers, Danish troops in the Sahel, French troops in the Sahel being expelled, forming that alliance, the alliance of the Sahelian states, and getting improving partnerships with China and Russia, which is a logical step to take, if you ask me. If you find yourself in a very militarized, very militaristic geopolitical space, you need partners, and the history shows that Europe has never been a partner of Africa. The Anglo-American world has never been friends with Africa. So your pundits, your West-centric pundits, some of them African, raising their noses at apparent interest in Chinese and Russian alliances. But can they tell me what options these states have? I have not seen the options these states have. If you have to indulge in, if you are engaged in the militarized context, I mean, and you said so also, Pascal, and I'll stop here. When you talk about the need for the instability, they are already propagandizing the possibilities of instabilities in places as stable as Ghana, trying to justify the presence of bases in that area in order to surround the AES, to surround the Sahelian states and instigate instability, upon which they can blame, they can create revolutions or do regime changes or do coups. That is necessary. The instability is a necessary precondition for coups and regime change. And that's what they want to do. And we pray it doesn't happen as it happened in Libya. They tried to do that in Libya. And when the people themselves didn't rise up against Gaddafi, they had to come in and take Gaddafi out himself. So that instability is crucial. And yes, but this for me signal the possibilities that they could be changed. And I think what the US has been doing to itself, especially even with these economic trade wars, increases the possibility for the move towards multipolarity, in which scenario the African states would have greater leverage and agency.
Peo, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question, right? And I mean, I think, yes, as always, things are changing. Question is, where, in what direction? How do we sense the accumulation or deaccumulation of power in various centers and so on? But I think, I mean, the changes now are significant, and I think with the Trump White House, they're both sort of doubling down and wake up calls going around, in not least in the EU, because there's been this mantra now for 20 years or something, often instigated by Eastern European voices and then adopted by Western European voices, saying that, we knew we couldn't have detente with Russia and Putin, and we can't trust Russia, and you should have listened to us because we know, we have first-hand experience and so on. But my mantra has always been, don't trust the US. And that's Trump, right? So all of a sudden, we can just retort, look, we told you so. You can't trust the Americans. Now they turn your back. They just decide to change and leave you. But historically, that has precedence as well, right? So we must remember that, yes, the US was very influential in creating the European Union in the 50s. But for West Germany and France, the EU project was also anti-American. And Eurafrica was the dream of a third way or a third force in world politics. Because people like Konrad Adenauer and numerous French leaders, we know that, they were very, very skeptical. They didn't accept the Cold War logic. They didn't accept the bipolar world order. They wanted it to at least be a tripolar with Eurafrica in the middle. And that was, of course, the hope they felt, that colonialism in Africa still survived 1945, whereas the European continent was occupied by the two superpowers. And so for the power centers in Western Europe, they felt that, no, we can expand southward and we can consolidate our power in Africa. That will be the third way. But next to that, of course, the suspicion, and I mean, the Suez Crisis is a perfect illustration. France, West Germany, they just got confirmation that they couldn't trust the Americans. And so the Suez Crisis and the Suez War was, of course, then a wake-up call for Europeans to say, we need to have the European Union. We need to have sort of our own geopolitical project in some way, because we cannot trust the Americans. And the same thing for West Germany. the defense question, when they got word of that the US maybe weren't interested in defending the whole of Germany against the Soviet attack, they called for nuclear weapons. So we, there are all sorts of historical parallels to go back to. And I think what I don't mention in the article and what we haven't talked about here is, of course, that we have these periods in history, but a very interesting period, I think, is the 70s and the 80s, because we had severe conflicts then between Western Europe and the US. But the conflicts then were mostly that the Americans felt that the Europeans were too soft, right? And that's the case today too. But today the European response to softness is to become a hard power. But in the 70s and 80s, the Western Europeans' response to the American accusation that Europeans were soft, not the least soft towards the Soviet Union, was for Europeans to say, no, we're going to continue to be soft because détente is the only way. De-escalation, disarmament, and all those things. There was a lot of progress in that era in that sense. But today, the Europeans, they respond in like doubling down on a failed strategy, thinking that they again can revitalize this third force, Europe, which I don't think they can. And I think the European Union is way too, there's too many splits, there's too much friction within the EU to create that. And I think also what is important is that when you poll Europeans, they don't look particularly interested in fighting wars when you speak to people. Okay. And I think the Ukraine war has been going on for over 3 years now, and it has been framed as our war, as a European war. Yet hardly any Europeans have put on their boots and marched to Ukraine to die in the trenches. And I think that is the sort of undercurrent that should be, I think, brought to the light, to say that if Europeans don't want to fight, to go to war and die and sacrifice for this hard power Europe, well, what is it then? But it also creates this alternative to say that if Europeans don't want to fight, well, there we have the embryo to a new peace movement, like we had in the 70s and 80s, a really strong peace movement that pressured politicians to continue with détente, to continue with even though they didn't like the Soviet Union, they said we have to coexist, so we have to talk, and to sort of, to pave the way for a new peace movement, for a new détente, for a new anti-geopolitical strategy.
Thank you for this, and we are already nearing the end, but I would still like to ask you, Aghogho, looking at it from South Africa, does the European fight with Russia make sense? Or like what's the interpretation of what is happening to the Europeans, like looking at it from South Africa?
That's not an easy question, but I think I can hazard to say that amongst those who pay attention, there is a strong understanding that Europe has never been our friend in geopolitical issues. So, for instance, I know in a recent seminar, colleagues were surprised to understand that there's a US base in Botswana. Botswana is one of the most stable, one of the more prosperous African countries. And because of the sour taste that apartheid still lives in the mouths of many South Africans, and the very hard facts about the complicity of Europe and America and the involvement of Europe and America in apartheid, and of course, because of the history that South Africa and African countries have, especially South Africa and Southern African countries, where they were more the so-called liberation were characterized by more militaristic events, more than, for example, in Nigeria, West Africa, for example. The understanding of that history is there with those who pay attention. And the understanding that whatever interest Europe shows in Africa at this moment is a selfish interest. It is a continuation of the period of what I call historical colonization. I try to divide them into historical colonization and contemporary colonization. Many decolonial scholars talk of coloniality, and as you know, in at least academic circles, that discussion has assumed currency strongly in the past 10 years. So there is no serious appetite. There are commentators who are even saying, thank God that the US is pulling their support. Here is an opportunity for us to be who we ought to be and rid ourselves of the shackles, of the Trojan horses that we have been given in the name of aid. So I think, and then the ways in which China has performed, although there's a strong propaganda from Western sources, Western thinkers, and West-centric African thinkers against whatever is happening in China. But I traveled recently to 3 countries. I had a team of colleagues. We went to Kenya. It was my trip to Kenya for the first time. We went to Uganda, and we went to Tanzania. And every airport you pass, every capital you pass in these 3 countries, you see physical signs of Chinese intervention in the terms of infrastructure. We drove on the road from Entebbe Airport to Kampala. At the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, I saw seats donated to the university by the Chinese. On the campus of Moi University in Eldoret in Kenya, we saw buildings donated in the 90s already by the Chinese. When we think of what we have received from the West, we think of the billions that are stashed away in Swiss accounts by comprado African leaders. So I think it's a continuation of illusion. If European thinkers think they are making an impression on Africans, they may be making that impression on their comprado academics and pundits. For instance, some of the analysis we hear about Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso these days. People talk about Ibrahim Traore in Kenya, in Nigeria, in churches, in seminar rooms. What does that mean? For me, it signifies a serious articulation of a rejection of European moralizations over the years. It demonstrates, and people will tell you, oh, they say he's a military man, okay, but what have the others who said they were politicians done for their countries? So and let me just say this as we round before you close, and pardon me, I make no pretensions of being a European expert. But if you study colonialism, then you study Europe and you study America, and that's part of what we do. The European media and academic complex have, in my view, deluded Europeans for decades into this false idea that they are actually superior morally, civilizationally, in terms of intelligence, in terms of basic human intelligence, and that everything they have is an outcome of that superiority of their hard work. It is unraveling. And we see especially Donald Trump's flailing and in the confusion over the Ukraine situation, that it doesn't seem as if Europeans are able to come to terms with the actual realities. doesn't spell good for Europe. And Yanis Varoufakis makes something very powerful also when he talks about cloud capital. You must have heard him speak about the inability of America to cope with, of Europe to cope with the advances in technology that you find in the US and in China. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We need a Europe, we need a world where everybody is aware of the importance of the other. As we did in 1884, as we did in 1945, so we do in 2025. And the sooner colleagues from everywhere come to this realization, the better I think it's going to be for the world. Sorry to sound moralistic, but
no, and the role of agency, that there's agency. I think Europe is as bad at conceptualizing the agency of others. My friends, we've reached the 1 hour mark. Peo, do you agree that we close it at this point?
Yes, that's fine.
Then Peo Hansen and Aghogho Akpome, I will put links to your work into the description of the box below, and I thank you both for your time today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Thank you. It's great. Thanks, Peo.
Thank you.